Are you trying to soundproof your cabinet, or are you trying to reduce the noise from your computer? Well, I interviewed Ted Weidman, who's been working as a soundproofing expert for over 14 years for the company Acoustical Surfaces. And during the interview, you're going to notice that I'm kind of a little bit off screen. That's because I didn't know that during a recorded Skype session, you have to stand more in the middle. But I promise that in the future upcoming interviews with soundproofing experts, the visuals will be much better. I didn't want to delete this interview because there is so much valuable content that I wanted to share with you. Oh, and make sure that you're sticking around till the end, because we will reveal the most common mistakes people make when they are soundproofing their cabinet. So, without further ado, let's go over to Ted. That I want to talk about certain subjects in order, bit by bit, and so that we are going to cover like, I don't know, about 10 different subjects, five, or let's say six subjects, 5 minutes apart. So that I wanted to ask you, for example, one of the first things would be if we could talk about how to soundproof, what are the best soundproofing materials, and then we can talk about that for 5 minutes.
Sure.
And then I'm going to talk specifically about certain subjects. All right?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Fantastic. Now, so could we start out by if you could tell me a little bit about yourself and how you started out with soundproof?
Absolutely. Well, my name is Ted Weidman. I am with a company called Acoustical Surfaces in Minnesota, which is in about the central United States. I've been here for a little over 16 years now. It's been interesting to see kind of what's changed with both building and the industry over that time. Well, it's just that we really started years and years ago. The orders were very small, and it was really an industry in its infancy. And as building materials have gotten harder with concrete and wood and glass and kind of more decorative finishes, the need for acoustical panels has dramatically increased. So it's just much busier, and the numbers are much different now than they were, decade and a half ago.
Cool. So it sounds a lot like you've gone a little bit up in scale. You mentioned that you're working with more like harder and different materials. Is it because you have a higher price tag, or is it because you've realized that they're just simply more practical, or is it a style thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not necessarily the pricing for the products has changed a whole lot. Certainly, as things go up in price, ours follows suit, just like cars and gas. But building materials, especially used in the commercial market, have really gotten to be much more decorative and aesthetic. For instance, in restaurants, at least here in the U.S., they used to have drop ceiling tiles, which would do a great job at absorbing some sound in the restaurant. But as they pull those out and go for a more industrial look, well, now we have a sound problem, and they need panels to fix it. I know all around the world they're building with a lot more concrete and marble and steel and glass, and all of those things are beautiful and they last a long time, but they make spaces hard to occupy because it can oftentimes be uncomfortable.
Okay, what is the most interesting development that you've seen in the soundproofing industry over the years?
I think some of the newer technologies are some of the clips that are used to hold drywall off of the face of the studs. We're able to build thinner walls that have higher soundproofing ratings than a staggered stud or a separated stud wall. Also, some of the vibration dampening compounds and some of the recycled materials have really gained popularity, and they really kind of revolutionized our industry over the past few years, I guess, maybe 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I was actually very last time we spoke, I was really surprised that you mentioned recycled car tires. That for me, that you use that as a way of soundproofing. To me, that kind of blew me away. I never thought that you could reuse car tires for something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of which, could we talk about what materials are the best for soundproofing, and what do you think when I'm saying the best soundproof? What does that mean to you as somebody who works technically with it, And also here in Sweden, at least, we are very interested in the eco-friendly alternative. And I'm wondering, what can you tell me for somebody who is completely starting out and doesn't even know what to pick regarding um, soundproofing materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, it's also a very difficult question in a couple different ways, and I think that it's probably best to start out with really defining, what soundproofing is, because they're having spoken and talked to and interacted with so many people over the years. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about what products do what things. So
Oh, let's start with that.
let's start with that. That's a good one. It's just good to differentiate between, am I trying to absorb the echo in a room, or am I trying to block the sound or reduce the amount of sound that's either coming into my space or leaving my space, or both? But really starting down that path in terms of what we're trying to do, and sometimes it's both, but getting that clarification, getting some clarification on that right away is the best thing to do to start.
I
Um,
actually had a really good example that I want to give you,
yeah,
that I mentioned last time. It was that I in my apartment, as you know, it's made out of concrete, everything except from this one, because on the other side I live. It's my kitchen, right? But everything else is concrete, and I hear a woman once per day. She sneezes, right? Which is really weird because I don't hear anything else. You can take a bulldozer on the other side of the wall, I wouldn't notice it. Now, how come I can hear her? And also, what's interesting is that I've lived here for more than a year. I still don't know in which apartment she lives in. I can't hear from which direction. I think it's that way, but I still can't really tell.
yeah.
How come only that?
Um, that's a good question, and it really has to do with the both the building itself, and as well as the direction. That the reason why you can't tell where it's coming from is because sound travels at about 1,300 feet per second, which is I don't know the kilometers, but it's
Very
basically
fast.
about very, very fast, about the same speed as a rifle bullet, so
Oh,
very,
okay.
very quickly. So um, basically what happens is, as that sound makes its way into your apartment from wherever it's coming from, it bounces around the room, multiple times, and your ear actually hears it more than just once. So now it's coming from this way, but a split second later, it's coming from a different direction as it reflects around in the space.
Okay.
Um, how it's getting in and where it's getting in really depends on the building. There could be a crack somewhere. There could be a little leak. It could be coming from under a doorway.
Mhm.
I usually tell people to look for any kind of path of least resistance or airspace
Mhm.
first. Um, if you imagine filling your apartment with water, how is the water going to get out? And that's exactly where the sound either gets out or gets in.
I get you. I think there are two things that you actually taught me, which is that I'm guessing that, first of all, the reason why I can hear her is because it's a female sneeze and it's echoey and it's extremely high pitch. And that's the only kind of sound that can really go through a very heavy and dense and also like a heavy material such as concrete.
Well,
Correct?
not exactly, actually.
No?
Typically, the lower frequency, the bass, the boom. Let's say you had a subwoofer or a banging of a big piece of metal, or things like that. Those frequencies and those types of noise, oftentimes are more bothersome, because they're a taller, longer wavelength
Hmm.
that makes its way through easier. Now,
Oh,
the
really?
wall or the ceiling that this sneeze could be coming through, there's a harmonic, right? It's basically a frequency that gets through a particular barrier easily. So it
Uh,
could just be a particular frequency that's getting through part of your room, and it just happens to be that wall or that ceiling's weak link. Could be.
Okay, so I actually checked, and there's a ventilation like pipe throughout all the apartments. It could be that you standing in the kitchen or something. So regarding materials, a high pitch sound. Let's say that somebody is playing the violin or something that is very very high pitched. the children screaming or something like that. So what materials would you have if you have a very high-pitched neighbor, if you
It
want to
really,
use that?
That's a good question. It depends a lot on how the wall is built. Oftentimes it's not the wall. Like you mentioned, I tell people to look for ductwork. Any kind of airspace that connects two rooms is always a weak link, potentially under and around a door. If it is the wall, there's some acoustically enhanced drywall that's out there. So it's specialty made drywall to block sound. There's also, have you heard of green glue?
Actually, yeah. A lot of our blog posts are mentioning it, but I've never heard from an expert explain exactly what's the deal with it. Because the way I understand it, it kind of absorbs the shaking, the vibration that creates the sound. Is that correct?
It is correct. Yep. So it's not actually glue. It's not going to glue up your second layer of drywall. So it doesn't actually harden like an adhesive. I usually explain it like if I have a bell and I put my fingers on the bell and I ring that bell, when my fingers hold the metal, that thing goes tink instead of ring. Right. So basically, it's a vibration dampener that helps to reduce the resonance and shake of the drywall. But you still have to screw through it into the stud, as your installation goes. But it's basically a way just to dampen energy as it comes through a wall. Okay.
And could you give me an example when you use that?
Oftentimes, if people aren't interested or aren't able to take their wall out and do a lot of demolition and then reconstruction, it's a very good product in terms of the value. So it's about $1 or so per square foot. So that plus your drywall is a very low cost.
So but you smear the object that is making the sound with it, or how do you apply it? How do you use it?
So if you've got a drywall wall, you take the second layer, the new layer of drywall, and you spread it around the back in a random curly Q pattern. You tip it up and squish the two together, and then screw through it into your studs.
Okay. All right. So I get you. Is there any? So that's one of the go-to, and then you said the drywall, the special one that you just mentioned, and also what else is kind of a go-to material that you're using if I'm going to a Walmart or something and I want to buy soundproofing stuff?
The soundproofing industry is really too specialized for most even building supply stores. Walmart and typical stores like that sell home goods aren't going to really have a whole lot that's going to do much for blocking sound or absorbing echo, really, that I know of.
Okay, but I heard, for example, that there is, if you want to soundproof yourself, then usually people recommend carpets, really thick carpets, or sound barriers, for example, or like these office supplies, these big blocks or something. Is there anything like that you would recommend? Like it's not going to cure everything, but it'll at least reduce the most annoying frequencies. Is there anything like that?
If it's echo, are we talking about echo inside of the space, or are we talking about sound that's leaking through into my room or out of my room?
We're talking about I was going to say both, but then there's a third option, which is the structural sound. When there is for example, if a child on above me who lives on the next floor, when they're jumping from a sofa down to the ground, that also creates a sound. Right. So we're talking about high frequency echoing. We're talking about also the more structural sound vibration, and then leakage. Yep. Which ones would you recommend for those three?
We'll talk about the echo first because that's the easiest. If you think about the echo as if it's I guess water, it's a good analogy, because if you put up something to absorb water, it's typically going to absorb sound as well. So pillows, quilts, sponges, things that are generally an inch or so thick, and have a kind of a maze or a porous nature, so that the sound and the wave of energy can get in there and kind of go through the matrix and then come back out weaker. I notice you have a really cool hanging behind you there. So depending on how thick that is, things like that are generally going to absorb water will generally absorb sound, and the thicker they are, the more sound and the more water they would absorb, the better they'll perform.
Yeah, you also gave me a really good tip that the way you have tested things was if you usually try to breathe through the material to see if you can breathe through it, then it's not 100% soundproof as much as it could be. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I don't remember when we were talking earlier about that topic, but oftentimes if I'm looking for something that's I think it was actually windows, maybe we were talking about in curtains, but if I'm looking for, something to absorb echo or be acoustically invisible, we use a lot of fabric to wrap over things to kind of dress them up and make them more decorative. I'm looking for a fabric that is acoustically invisible. So I'll hold it up and see if I can breathe through it, or hold it up to the light and to see if I can see light coming through the pores. And if I can, then the sound can get through it. So if you're looking to put curtains into your living situation, if you can hold them up to the mouth and breathe through them, or hold them up to the light and see through them, they're really not going to do much. They're almost acoustically invisible. So a tighter weave or thicker, composition of a curtain is going to absorb more because it's not as acoustically transparent.
I see, because I also know that we talked about it once before that when you are hanging sound curtains, like specific curtains that if you have a very noisy, I don't know, you're living outside a motorway or something like that, the perhaps one of the kind of it's like one patch that you can use is having these sound curtains, and they're usually very heavy, but they are very widely. If the window is this wide, then usually the curtain are stretched like that. So could you explain why they're so heavy, and also why they have to, if the window is like this, they have to go all the way over there?
Yeah, for sure. The more mass and density something has, so the heavier something is, the more sound it blocks. So that the idea would be that you want a heavy curtain to help increase the amount of mass the sound wave has to pass through to get from outside to inside, or point A to point B. And typically you want to break up the straight line, because if I have if I have a car window and I'm sitting in my car, and I have a straight line where I can see and look out, that offers a straight line for the sound to get from point A to point B as well. Right, so ideally, if that sound is coming in and there's a little gap between the window and the wall and the curtain, it's just going to travel straight through it. But if I close that, it has to go around. The further it goes and the more stuff it goes through, the weaker it is once it gets to your ear.
I get it. Well, so that's a lot of the echo. How would you say regarding the structural sound and also leakage of sound? What materials would you usually go to there?
Yeah, structural sound is really tough, especially when we have apartments or situations where you really can't do much to the structure. If I go back to the analogy of a kid jumping off of a couch onto the floor, that kid is going to introduce so much energy to the floor that's going to shake the floor very slightly. And the people downstairs will it'll hear a big boom. And that boom is created by the floor flexing just a little bit, much like a subwoofer or a speaker makes a slight boom, and it pushes a wave of energy and pressure into the air.
Right.
Once that structure is moving, there's unfortunately not a whole lot you can do to reduce that.
Yeah, you would have to rebuild the whole thing, basically.
Yeah, the best way is to put down the rubber that we mentioned before. It's a recycled rubber on the floor, and then put the finished floor so that the rubber can absorb the impact, kind of like a jogging shoe. You think about the energy, it's going to travel through the ceiling, but the walls are also bolted into the same structure. So the walls will shake too. So it gets really tricky when we start talking about impact. There are some clips that I mentioned before that float the drywall off of the structure. They're also on rubber, so they can kind of wiggle a little bit as well. So the impact is really tough, just because it's much more violent kind of energy hitting the floor, rather than if that kid was yelling, that floor is not going to move.
I get you. Well, so There's also you mentioned yeah, those are the ones that I imagine it has to be some kind of material that absorbs the shock a little bit, like putting a pillow under something that has a lot of force. Like if you're dropping a bowling ball, obviously you don't want something really hard. You want like a pillow under it that would absorb it. So a little bit like that, right?
Right. And to be honest, good carpet pad and good carpet put in upstairs is probably the most cost-effective way to treat the floor, because you're not doing any real construction, you're adding carpet.
Yeah.
Oftentimes I hear about these problems becoming much, much worse when the carpet is removed and wood floor or marble floor or whatever is installed upstairs.
Okay. That makes sense. And regarding leakage, what is your go-to material and tool that you use?
That really depends quite a bit on the structure. You know,
What
and
is
it
the
depends.
com-
Go ahead.
Sorry to ask, but what is the most common like leakage that you realize that, oh, that guy didn't think about this and that?
I often, you know, if I'm talking about room to room within a house, let's say, I always tell people to look for the heating and cooling ductwork. You know, listen to the ducts to see if it's a pipe that the sound is just coming in. Check the gaps under and around the doors, and look for any kind of space where we have air connecting two rooms. I really, you know, I kind of use the analogy of what's the best way to fix a car? Well, that depends on what's broken. And, you know, what's the best way to fix a sound problem really depends on, you know, getting a good idea of where the problem is happening now, so that you don't put a bunch of money and time into the wall and then find out it's coming through the ductwork or whatever. But if we're talking, go ahead, sorry.
No. I'm just thinking that is probably the best example, because I know I've just like you have, I've read a lot of blogs that tells like this and this is the best material, but it just makes much more sense that you're obviously trying to figure out exactly what is the thing that causes all the leakage and all the problems. But we've mentioned, we've talked about that weather strips, for example, is a fantastic way. And also this, what is it called? There's a thing you can put underneath the door so that there is no sound coming through and no wind coming through. And you can use those kind of like things to fill in the space between like the window and door, just so that neither wind or sound can come through. Is there anything else in those lines you could recommend?
You know, we sell quite a few door seal kits, and it's basically a kit that goes around the door and then one piece on the bottom, and that's simply offering a rubber neoprene gasket for the door to close onto, and then a piece on the bottom that actually will lower down to the floor when the door is closed. And it's just exactly what you mentioned. The idea is to stop or reduce airflow. Same with windows. You know, airtight is really important when we're talking about reducing sound.
Okay. Is there anything else that you feel is worth mentioning regarding materials generally that people need to know when they're starting out soundproofing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the most common two misconceptions that I just would want to make sure that people are aware of is that, you know, people call or they'll ask me, you know, hey, can I put up some panels on my wall? And I'll ask them, well, you know, they always ask for foam, you know, pyramid foam, egg crate foam, that kind of thing. And I'll always ask them, what's the goal? Are you trying to absorb echo or block sound? And a lot of people think that foam blocks sound, as well as insulation inside the wall. It's good to know that these things are good products in their own use. Insulation in the wall isn't going to reduce a whole lot of sound transmission, but it will help the wall assembly block sound. But foam panels and acoustical panels are just not a good sound barrier, because they're like a sponge absorbing water rather than a piece of glass when you build a fish tank. So just understand kind of what's out there and what panels or products do what thing before you spend money that you don't need to.
Okay, could you give me an example of a type of sound that these sound panels are good for?
Well, they're good at absorbing different types of sound, but they're used to control the echo. So if you had a apartment that was all concrete, like a friend of mine does, and she can't watch a movie in her apartment because sound is just bouncing everywhere and it just sounds very muddy or unclear. Those panels are good to absorb the echo so that I'm only hearing the sound once, not hearing it multiple times as it bounces around the room. And I would say
I guess it's because right now behind me there's an empty wall, and if I want the sound quality to be good in this video, pitch perfect, then I would probably need these sound panels behind me. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
You bet.
All right. Great. I think that's it for the for the material part. I feel like I could talk for an hour about that, but I feel like we've covered a lot. I have a question regarding. I want to go over and talk a little bit about wall-proof. Let's see, soundproof wallpapers. How much experience do you have them? And can you give me some comments? Is it worth it? Is it a real? Or how much experience do you have, and what is your experience with it?
I don't know if I've ever seen it necessarily a soundproof wallpaper. At least not here in the U.S., not that I can think of. I would guess that the wallpaper, it may dampen some of the vibration energy of the wall. I'm purely speculating here because I've never seen any data or samples of a chunk. So it's really hard to say, but I don't have much of it.
So you've heard about soundproof paint, though, right? So I'm just surprised that somebody who has your experience have never heard of it. So maybe it's and since you haven't heard any data about this, then maybe it's not something that people should put all their money on game data. But maybe you could comment about why it could work, why it could not work, and also your opinion about soundproof paint, because I know you've worked with that.
Yeah, we have a line of soundproof paint. It's typically used in an instance where there aren't very many other options, or there aren't any other options. And, is something better than nothing? Sure, absolutely. Typically, paint is going to absorb some of the vibration energy of the wall. It's usually put on pretty thick. It usually stays viscous, so it doesn't ever, kind of harden, like paint would. If you have old paint, you go to chip it off, and it's like a piece of plastic. So the paint is something you can apply to your wall when there aren't any other options.
It sounds like a last resort. How come? What is it? Does it just reduce with a couple of percentage points, or is it just how does it work? How can paint reduce sound to begin with?
Well, paint doesn't typically, at least the paint that exists today that I know of, doesn't have a very significant amount of mass and density. So you can't apply only so much to the wall before I'm sure it would start to slide off. And I'm speculating a bit, but it certainly is a last resort. There's other technologies and building materials out there that will block more sound than a paint type of product, simply because of the physics involved. But I say soundproof paint is good, better than nothing, just not as good as some of the other materials that are out there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for example, putting a layer of drywood wall or something like that.
Right. Usually, typically, the good rule of thumb is the heavier, the better.
Okay. This is an interesting one. There was a person I'm working with. He wants to know what are your if we could talk about the benefits, the health benefits of soundproofing. Is it just so that you are not annoyed by the kids? Is that it, or is there anything else?
A health benefit for the kids, so you don't run them out of the house.
Actually, yeah, I can see why that's the main argument.
Right. Well, it's sound is energy in the air. And if you leave a noisy restaurant, if you're in a restaurant and it's full and it's packed, it's very hard to relax. You kind of find yourself tensing up. Relaxation is certainly a part of rest and recovery. And there certainly is a thing, ear fatigue. There's plants and industrial places that monitor their sound pressure very, very carefully and very closely so that the health of their workers aren't affected. I try, especially sleeping and needing a quiet space. I think, humans, as our brains work and try to process our environment, need that downtime. work environments can be, counterproductive when they're too loud, and people can get distracted. So there's all kinds of, health and safety things that, can certainly be argued about sound and sound quality, as well as just efficiencies in, speech and understanding. So your brain doesn't have to work so hard to figure out what that person is saying across the table or the room.
Yeah, I've heard that people. I remember there was a study. I don't remember which one, so don't quote me on this. But it's people who live near a highway generally have a higher blood pressure. If you just have that thing that like, let's say a twin lives in the forest, right? And then generally it seems like people who are living very near highways and very near cities, they generally sleep worse, and they are a bit more stressed, even though they tell like, no, it doesn't really bother me. How could you explain that from a sound perspective? How come?
I think there's some physiology there that is way above my pay grade. But actually, as this global pandemic started to kind of shut things down around the world, I know there were geological studies done that showed seismic decreases in the amount of energy in the earth as traffic was pulled off the streets. Which I thought was really, really interesting, because it basically says as we as humans interact with our modern world, with our cars and trucks and planes and trains and all the things that we do, typically in an urban environment, that's introducing energy into the environment, both into the structure, into the buildings, of course, into the air. So I would certainly think that there's something to be said about, a quieter, more comfortable space is just easier for the human anatomy to exist in.
Yeah, I've heard that because what I was going for and hoping that maybe you could shine some light upon is that I heard that if you live near like a highway and places that create these sounds, they create these like, I think it's infrasound or ultrasound that it makes you feel uncomfortable, but you can't really put your finger on it. And apparently, in the olden days, when people wanted to make horror movies, they put in these really low frequencies that people can't hear, but they just felt uneasy whenever they heard the sound. And apparently, people hear that, but they can't put the finger on what it is when they live very near a road. Do you have any experience with this? Is this true, or is it just something that I read?
It may be true. I mean, in theory, there are all kinds of sounds around us that we can't hear. Animals can hear that we can't. Mm-hmm. And there are measurable sounds in the world that our human ear can't pick up. And as you get older, and not you, me, I can't hear as well as I used to. So I would think it's going to affect people differently. But I would certainly think that there are vibrations and energies in the air and in the world around us that our bodies will perceive that our ears necessarily won't. But I've never done any research on that. That's purely speculative and, just kind of my basic knowledge of the physics involved. But I would think it's probably a real thing.
Yeah, and I guess the last point that I read about regarding soundproof and the health of it is that it literally, if there is too much sound, for example, if you work at concerts, obviously, even if you wear earplugs, then that is going to affect how fast your hearing is going to deteriorate. Whether we want it or not, even if you always live in the forest or something, the hearing will deteriorate over the age, but that will go much faster if you are working in a very loud environment. And you can actually see that with road workers or people who work in the music industry. So I'm guessing that you've worked a lot with people who work with music. Have you also experienced that people complain about health problems or perhaps sound problem, hearing problems?
What's that?
Well,
that was a joke. That was. I'm just saying that because I'm old.
You don't look that old.
Not necessarily health or hearing problems. Really, the people that I work with most days are just looking to increase the comfort or the usability of their environment. It probably would end up there, but Most of the time, it's just a kind of a comfort or a speech intelligibility type of situation.
I get you. Let's see. Cabinet. I want to go to a specific room. Talk about a specific room. How would you soundproof a laundry room? Like if somebody tells you like Ted, I have this laundry room, it's loud. What are the basic questions you're going to ask in order to find out what you need to work on first, and what is your go-to method?
Yeah. So I would say, okay, where is this laundry room? Is it in an apartment, a condo, or a house?
Well, let's just say it's in a big villa, in a big house in the suburbs.
In the house in the suburbs. Is the laundry room on the same floor, or is it above you or below you?
Below you.
Below you. If you put a cup of coffee on the floor, can you see any vibration? Can you see any rings in that coffee?
Well, let's go with two examples. In the one case, I say no, and the other one, yes.
Perfect. So first of all, I would say I would look for vibration board energy, because that tells me if the machine, when running, is introducing a vibration energy into the structure, that is moving waves of pressure in the air, and I hear as a sound. Mm-hmm. Probably either way, I would most likely say some simple vibration isolators in that, underneath the laundry in the floor, mm-hmm. are a good thing. It's going to let that machine wiggle and move without energy getting into the structure.
Oh, so like the first thing would probably be in the case of when the coffee is standing on the floor that you could just put some towels or something right underneath the washing machine so it doesn't vibrate that much, correct?
I wouldn't say towels. There are all kinds of little rubber vibration isolators.
Okay.
That we sell, as well as maybe some small chunks of like a rubber flooring, or even if you have some old shoes or something, that are going to allow that machine to wiggle and move, kind of like suspension of a car. It's not going to get the energy into the structure. You certainly don't want to cause some instability, so the machine would fall over. But just, if you take a cell phone on vibrate and you put it on your desk, it rings and you hear it. If you put that thing on a pillow and it vibrates, it's much, much quieter. So that same theory of getting the moving thing off of the structure so that it can do its job without introducing energy. If it were just simply a loud, clanging and thumping, I would say, is the door closed? Do we seal the door? Is there any kind of ductwork or airspace that's connecting the laundry room with wherever, you are? Maybe increase the mass of the door, maybe screw some plywood or sheetrock to it to make it heavier. But I'd really try to, again, start asking those questions to try to find out what's going on so that we kind of target our approach rather than saying, this works every time.
Yeah, because that's kind of I've noticed when I read up on the subject, whether people are writing online about whether soundproof a bedroom or laundry room or something, people generally, it comes down to soundproof the wall, soundproof the door, soundproof the ceiling. But listening to this, it just makes more sense. Find out exactly first what it is that you need to soundproof. So usually, obviously, the thing that sounds the most is the washing machine. But is there a difference because I know the washing machines in particular, they are heavier compared to the dryer. Does that affect at all if you're working with something that is, both of them are loud, but the dryer, you can usually lift it up with both your hands, at least where I'm from. And would you say that affects, do you treat a washer differently than a dryer?
I think it really depends on, I would say sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think I'm going to dodge your question here.
We need to go on taking a stand, but
right. The heavier something is, the more energy and the more likely it's going to have. Once that water and the machine starts moving around, it's kind of like a great big person walking across the room rather than a very small person walking across the room. It can introduce more energy into the structure. But I've seen plenty of dryers that get off balance, and even though they're light, when they're heavy, full of a couple of shirts or pair of pants, and they all glob to one side, that thump, thump, thump as the thing spins around can really cause a lot more vibration than a heavy washer. So Also we've got one of those new high efficiency washers that spin the clothes to kind of pre-dry them before they go into the dryer.
Mm-hmm.
And when that thing hits a particular RPM, our whole upstairs will shake. You'd think a soundproofing guy would bring home something for his wife to fix that, but I'm too lazy. So I guess it really
sense. Yeah,
it depends on the machine.
It makes sense that certain frequencies are the ones that go through, like certain structures. Yeah. What is your go-to solution for soundproofing a window? And what are the most common questions that you ask in order to find out exactly what the problem with the window is? And what are the most common mistakes that people do when they are working with soundproofing?
Absolutely. But first, I ask, is the window closed? Closing the window is really important, making sure it's closed all the way and sealed tight. Just making sure it functions, as the window should is a great place to start. If it's closed all the way, I typically ask, if I put a common noise source outside, like a radio, or if there's traffic, can you pick up with your ear exactly what part of that window is the weakest link? And can we gasket it? You mentioned weather stripping before. So weather stripping the window so it's as airtight as possible is certainly the first. Mm-hmm. And probably the most important thing. Oftentimes, we have windows. I have a window right here. If I take a chunk of that window out and I weigh it, and I take a chunk of the wall out the same size and I weigh it, the window almost always weighs less.
Yeah.
And so the sound is coming through the part of the building that's either not quite airtight or weighs the least, has the least amount of mass and density, right? So if the window's airtight, we've actually got a product called a climate seal window. And it's basically a retrofit window that clicks in place with magnets, much like, think of your refrigerator door. The perimeter is that magnetic seal that when it's closed, it seals up.
Yeah.
So we basically have a clear piece of plastic with a perimeter of those magnets that just clicks in place onto a metal channel that seals up that airspace between your new kind of fake window or plastic window and the actual window for the building.
Okay, so you talked about mass and you talked about your products, and I'm wondering. It made me think that I've stood in skyscrapers, and a lot of them they have like almost like 2-inch thick glass, right? And the thickness, and also there is another one where there's just 3 glasses, right next to each other. And the whole purpose of it is why I thought it was also always the insulation thing, that there was air between them, but also that this simply gives mass, and that's what makes it soundproof. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that happen. If I yell, or if there's energy that's passing, from this direction, when it hits the glass, some of it's going to bounce off, but it's also going to vibrate that glass just a little bit. And then that sound transfers back into an airborne sound. The vibration transfers back into an airborne sound. Then it hits this glass and it vibrates that glass a little bit. And then it comes through as a sound.
Right.
So it's pressure, vibration, pressure, vibration, pressure. And every time it changes forms like that, it loses energy. So if I've got 2 sound barriers, glass, with an airspace in between, that's usually more efficient and more energy efficient for thermal reasons than just one thick piece of glass, because this now thick piece of glass doesn't change forms more than one time.
Okay, I get you. And what are the most common mistakes people do when they are trying to soundproof their window?
Most common is probably put foam or put styrofoam or put that pink polystyrene board up in the window. I've talked to a lot of people who've used the wrong product to make a window plug, if you will. And those things aren't heavy. They don't add much mass. So we want to increase mass and density of the window if it's at all possible. I've also had a lot of people will take the window trim, the trim off the window, and use a sealant or a caulk in between the window and the frame and the rough opening of the building, and sealing up that airspace, even if it's insulation, just seal that airspace off to make that wall and the window more of an airtight assembly.
Okay, and I see. And what would be the best products generally that you want to use, except from the I imagine there's this green glue. Could that help, or would you say that weather sealant? What is the thing that could help regarding if there's leaking sound, or generally if there's if you want to improve the soundproofness?
Yeah, green glue isn't going to work for that. Green glue is really used between layers of drywall or sheetrock. But using an acoustical sealant to seal up any gaps and cracks, or even, like a drywall mud or something that's dense and heavy and can make an airtight seal when it's installed, that's important. I've had people take plexiglass, like regular Lexan or plexiglass, and make their own window. Usually put some weather stripping around the perimeter where it's going to touch the frame so that it's airtight, and that will allow it to move and wheel a little bit as well. But I would say the most common misconception about reducing sound through a window is that a foam or styrofoam will help.
Okay. Last subject. We talked about it last time. It's how to soundproof a garden.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and that one. Could you tell me like what is the go-to thing you would recommend if you don't care too much about visibility, you just want to have your little Zen garden and you don't care about the outside world, just block it out. What do I do?
You take earmuffs, those big earmuffs, and you put those on.
You know what's funny? I was actually one of the cover photos I'm going to use for the blog post about that. It will be me standing like this with earplugs, because obviously that's what you do.
Yeah.
You can take a look at it later, but it's let's say that you have a lot of money, but for some reason you can't use earmuffs, right?
You're allergic.
Or hats. Like this is no. But if you want to redecorate the garden or like use what kind of materials would you do if you just want it so that the area is more quiet?
Yep. So if I had a garden and it's right by a motorway or a street or something, and I want to keep the sound from the cars, getting in. Misconceptions. Should we start there? Trees, shrubbery, landscaping. Really anything I can grow out of the ground to block the site isn't going to block much sound. If I got running fast enough, I could probably, run through those. Or if I shot a gun, the bullet would end up making its way through that. A tree and a shrub is mostly air. If I really compress it down, it's not very big. So it takes up a big volume, but it's a lot of airspace. And anytime I have airspace, I have a path for sound.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I need to ask you this again because we haven't talked about this when we're talking about the garden. But how come, for example, if I'm standing in a forest, there are a lot of trees there. Even though if I walk into a forest, like I don't know how many yards or like meters or how far I go in there, but it's generally more quiet inside of the forest. Even though you just went out from a road. At least a little bit. How come? Even though you're saying that you shouldn't use trees and shrubberies in order to reduce the noise pollution.
So in a situation like that, as you increase your distance from a noise source, traffic and things like that, the sound travels through more air. And as it travels through air, it slows down and it gets impeded by the air itself. So the sound pressure is weaker. If you're in a forest, maybe back to that psychology standpoint where, those are natural sounds, but you also have softer surfaces. You have soft ground. You have, trees with bark and, leaves and things that the sound has to interact with, that it's not going to be as stark and uncomfortable. You have birds and you have, rustling of trees and the wind and things like that are noise sources, but they're typically not as shrill and as uncomfortable as an urban environment, but you're also you're surrounded by soft or softer surfaces, especially when you consider the ground as an absorber.
I see. So it's in that same regard, that it could actually make you feel as if it's more quiet and peaceful, that you get the impression that it's more like tranquil. So I guess if you're like one of the reasons why a lot of people who are writing about this subject say like, oh, put in a lot of trees and shrubberies, it'll make it more quiet. So the truth to the matter is it will make it feel more quiet and feel more like comfortable, but it doesn't actually make the whole sound any change to it, correct?
It may in certain situations and it may not in others. If we go back to like an urban garden, and I were to surround that and I want to make my own little quiet space, I would use the tallest you can allow to build the fence. If I can use concrete or block, cinder block or something, I would make the wall as heavy and as dense and as tall as I could, so that the sound from the cars hits that and then bounces off in a different direction.
Right.
I would also line it with some shrubs because those look a lot better than concrete does.
Yeah.
And it's also going to absorb some of the echo and the bounce around in that garden area. But if a plane flies over a city or a plane flies over a forest at the same height, that sound still travels right down to my ear, and it's going to probably sound pretty close to the same. But in a city, it's bouncing off all the buildings as well as coming straight, rather than just coming down in the forest and you hear it once and then it gets absorbed into the ground.
I get you. Well, I also got a question from a writer that I'm working with regarding sheds. That where can you put sheds, and does it help to have small structures in your garden, or is there something you can put in your garden that's going to help overall the soundproof?
I don't think so.
No.
Unless, if you imagine the noise source as a spotlight,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I've got a wall and some of the light is coming over it, and I put a shed here and I'm standing here and I'm in the shadow of that shed from the spotlight. You'll also be in a shadow from the sound that would be coming in that same direction.
Mm.
So if you've got a particular seating area or something that you put fairly close to a shed, and then the sound is coming from that way, the shed is going to shield a small area of ground from some of the noise, unless it's, bouncing off of another building and coming this way. So I don't see any structures that, will really do a whole lot, because you still share a lot of airspace with whatever's out there making that sound.
I see. Yeah, that's what I would guess, because it's because the only thing that you said that really would help was the really thick and extremely heavy fence. That's the only thing and it should also be tall so that the sound doesn't really go over. But other than that, you're probably right. It doesn't really affect. And also that's also the argument why the privacy fence that you've mentioned before, why it doesn't really do much for the soundproofing. It only reduces visibility, but not sound, right?
Yeah, I mean, it may reduce a little bit of sound. Is some fence better than no fence at all? I would say yes, as long as it's mostly airtight.
Mm-hmm.
But if I take a piece of fence, and let's say it's 50 square meters, and I cut a 1% hole in that, 30% of the sound is going to come through that 1% hole.
Oh, okay.
If I have a 5% hole, 90% of the sound comes through a 5% hole. So if a privacy fence is well built and the joints are really tight, I would say that's probably pretty good. But as wood especially will shrink and expand with different amounts of temperature and moisture, that performance may change as the airspace changes.
I see. Yeah, and I guess there are so many misconceptions regarding how to soundproof a garden that pretty much anything that is not like a really thick, big fence, it's just like putting the cherry on the cake. It doesn't really add much value, except from like that fence that we talked about, correct?
Yeah, and there may be some placebo in there. If I build a tree, or I'm sorry, if I build a hedge and I can't see through it into the street, if I perceive less sound at my ear, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm taking it from like a physics-based standpoint and a real acoustics geek, and just trying to give you the best and most accurate information I can. But if you're doing something and it makes you feel better, nothing wrong.
I get you. Yeah, because you have actually mentioned that you can probably just talk through a normal shrubbery, and it's, yeah. I get it. I think that's it for the interview regarding.
Thank you for watching. If there is a particular topic you want me to interview a soundproofing expert about, then please write it down in the comment section below, and I'll definitely get back to you. Also, if you like this kind of content, then please subscribe. I'm going to put out a lot of content like this with a little bit better video quality in the near future. Until next time, take care.